I found out on a Thursday. Not because she told me, because I opened the wrong drawer looking for a pen and found the transfer orders already signed, stamped, and sealed in an envelope addressed to my commanding officer. My wife's signature was at the bottom. Captain Olivia Hargrove. Neat, precise, and completely devastating. I stood there in our kitchen, still in my PT gear, sweat cooling on my neck, holding the envelope like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. My brain was doing something strange, processing and refusing to process at the same time, while my body just stood very still and read the document a second time, then a third, because the words weren't changing no matter how many times I looked at them. Transfer request. Sergeant First Class Richard Hargrove, 3rd Brigade Combat Team, Forward Operating Base Kestrel, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Effective 30 days from authorization. Olivia had requested my transfer to a combat zone. My own wife. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't discussed it, hadn't asked me, warned me, or even hinted at it over the past week of dinners and morning coffees and the kind of quiet, ordinary evenings that you live through without knowing they're the last of something. She'd just signed the paperwork and sealed the envelope and put it in the drawer next to the takeout menus and the extra batteries. I didn't know yet that there was more. I didn't know that the transfer request was the least of what she'd done. That was coming. But in that moment, standing in the kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the morning light coming through the window at the same angle it always did, I made myself a promise. By the time this was over, every person who had watched her do this to me, every person who had known and said nothing, would watch something very different happen. What none of them knew was that in less than 2 years, I would come back to this base as the commanding general over every single one of them. And I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened. Olivia and I had been married for 6 years. We met at Fort Bragg when I was a staff sergeant and she was a freshly commissioned second lieutenant, which meant she technically outranked me and never let me forget it, though she always said it with a smile that made the joke land soft. She was sharp, ambitious, beautiful in a way that didn't ask for attention but got it anyway. I was proud of her. That matters, because what came after could look like I was a fool, and I want you to understand that I wasn't. I was a man who trusted his wife. We'd built a life on this installation. Fort Denton, Georgia. She'd climbed to captain, taken command of the 2nd Support Battalion's headquarters company. I was SFC in the same brigade, which meant our careers occasionally intersected in briefings and planning cycles, which was unusual and required some navigation, but we were both professionals. We made it work. Or I thought we did. The morning I found the envelope, I put it back in the drawer. Exactly as I found it. I closed the drawer, finished my protein shake, and drove to work. I needed to know how far this went before I moved a single piece on the board. 3 days later I knew enough. One of my soldiers, Corporal Danny Webb, was the kind of kid who noticed everything and said little. Perfect qualities in reconnaissance, which was his MOS. He came to me not because he was looking for trouble but because he thought I already knew, and he felt guilty about staying quiet as long as he had. He asked if we could talk off post. We drove to a Waffle House 12 miles from the gate and he told me what he'd been seeing for 4 months. Captain Olivia Hargrove had been meeting Lieutenant Colonel Brett Calloway at an off-post house in Macon every Tuesday and Thursday. Calloway was the Brigade S3, the operations officer. He was the man who, among other things, had final recommendation authority on personnel assignments within the brigade. He was also, it turned out, the man who had first floated the idea of my transfer and had given Olivia the paperwork to co-sign using her authority as a company commander, bypassing the standard routing because he controlled the routing. Danny had photographs. He'd taken them on his phone because he'd seen Calloway's personal vehicle, a black F-150 with a Clemson sticker, parked outside what he knew was Olivia's college friend's empty rental property 3 times. He'd run the plate. He'd connected the dots. He was 22 years old and more loyal to me than my wife was. I looked at the photographs. I didn't say anything for a while. I paid for both our meals and told Danny that he'd done the right thing and that I would handle it from here and that he was not to discuss this with anyone. He nodded. He understood. The betrayal was bigger than the transfer. The transfer was the mechanism. The affair was the motive. But I still didn't know the full scale of it. What I couldn't see yet was going to be so much worse. I spent the next 72 hours gathering everything I could without alerting either of them. I accessed our joint bank account records, we still had one, for household expenses, and found 12 withdrawals over 6 months at a hotel in downtown Macon that neither of us had ever discussed, ranging from $80 to $140 each. I pulled our cell carrier records, which I had legal access to as the account holder. 341 text exchanges between Olivia's number and Calloway's in the past 90 days. I printed everything. I organized it by date in a manila folder that I kept in my truck. I also made a phone call to my brother, Thomas, who worked as a civilian paralegal in Atlanta. I told him what was happening. He drove down that Saturday and sat with me at my kitchen table. Olivia was on post for a command function, and looked at everything I had. He told me what my options were. He gave me the name of a military divorce attorney in Augusta who handled cases involving officer misconduct. He also told me something that I hadn't yet fully processed. What Calloway and Olivia had done with that transfer request might constitute a violation of Article 92 and potentially Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Misuse of official authority, fraternization, conduct unbecoming. Thomas wasn't a JAG attorney, but he knew enough to know that what I was holding wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a paper trail. I still hadn't played my final card. I was saving it for when it would hurt the most. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday. I chose Tuesday because I knew she'd be coming back from Macon. I knew the schedule now. I knew she'd walk through the door at around 7:15, and I knew she'd be composed, because she'd had practice. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she came in. The folder was open in front of me. The transfer orders were on top. She saw me before she saw the folder. She said, "Hey, you're home early," and started to set her bag down, and I said, "Sit down, Olivia." Something in my voice stopped her. She looked at the table. She saw the documents. I watched the composure she'd built over 4 months develop a crack right down the center. I didn't ask her if it was true. I didn't give her a question she could maneuver around. I turned the transfer orders to face her and I said, "You requested my transfer to a combat FOB in Helmand Province. You co-signed the paperwork with Calloway routing it around standard channels. I want you to explain to me, out loud, why you did that." She said, "Richard, I put the bank statements on top of the transfer orders. Then the call records. Then Danny's photographs, printed on plain paper, the black F-150 visible in each one, the Macon address consistent. I put them down one at a time, not fast, not slow. Each one landed like a separate verdict." She stopped talking. I said, "You've been meeting Brett Calloway twice a week for at least 4 months. You used your command authority to co-sign paperwork that would have shipped me to a forward operating base in a kinetic area of operations so that you could, what? Have more time. Have a cleaner story. I need you to say it, Olivia, because I want to be very clear on what actually happened here." She said, "It wasn't like that." I said, "Then tell me what it was like." She started with the version people always start with. "We grew apart, you were always working, I didn't feel connected to you anymore." I let her go through it. I didn't interrupt. I watched her face and I noticed when the story shifted from explanation to justification, and I noticed when she stopped making eye contact. She got to the part where she said it had only been 4 months and I put the hotel receipts on top of the pile. 12 of them, dating back 7 months. She went quiet. I said, 7 months, Olivia. And the transfer request went to Calloway's desk 6 weeks ago. So walk me through the logic. You're having an affair with the Brigade S3. You want me gone. He has the authority to move personnel and you have the authority to co-sign as company commander. You use both. You put me on a helicopter to Afghanistan. And then what? You and Calloway set up house here on post. In my quarters. She said, "It wasn't going to be." I said, "I don't want the rest of that sentence. I want you to understand something. That envelope was never submitted. I found it before it went anywhere. The transfer didn't happen. But everything in this folder did. And I have spent this week making sure every piece of it is documented, time-stamped, and already in the hands of my attorney." Her face changed then. Not guilt. Fear. I said, "There is also the matter of Article 134, fraternization, and the question of whether signing a fraudulent personnel action to remove a spouse from a combat theater constitutes misuse of official authority. My attorney is very interested in that question." She said, "You're going to report this." I said, "I'm going to do several things. This marriage is over. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I need you out of this house by the end of the week. The third thing, you'll find out when it happens." I stood up, picked up the folder, and walked to the bedroom. I locked the door. I heard her in the kitchen for a while, and then I heard the front door, and then I didn't hear anything. The same people who had watched Brett Calloway walk through their battalion with his rank on his chest and his hand in my wife's loyalty would watch something very different before this was done. The next morning I was ice. Not the brittle kind, the deep, structural kind that doesn't melt under pressure but just gets harder. I went for a 6-mile run at 5 a.m., and somewhere around mile 4, the grief I'd been keeping in a sealed room inside my chest burned itself out completely. I came back to an empty house and I stood in the shower and I made a decision. I was done being the victim in this story. Not because I was going to be careless about it, because I was going to be precise. I called Thomas from the truck. He connected me to the Augusta attorney, a woman named Catherine Dole who had 20 years of military family law and UCMJ work behind her. I drove to her office that afternoon. She reviewed everything I had, asked me several questions that were organized and clinical, and then sat back and told me I had one of the cleanest cases she'd seen for both the divorce and the misconduct report. She told me to stop using my personal cell for anything sensitive and handed me a burner to use for communications with her office. She was a serious person. I liked that. I also made a call to a man named Colonel James Whitfield, who had been my company commander when I was a young staff sergeant and was now the garrison commander at Fort Denton. Whitfield and I had stayed in contact the way that soldiers who respect each other do, not frequently, but consistently. I didn't tell him everything. I told him I had information about a potential UCMJ violation involving officer misconduct and asked him what the appropriate reporting channel was at the installation level. He told me to put it in writing and route it through the Inspector General. He also told me, quietly, that the IG at Fort Denton had been looking for cause to open a file on Calloway for 8 months, because there had been other irregularities in personnel actions during his tenure as S3 that hadn't risen to the level of reportable offense on their own. Mine wasn't alone. That changed the math considerably. My two closest allies were Thomas and a buddy of mine named Corporal Webb, Danny, who had already shown he understood what loyalty meant. Thomas was handling the legal architecture. Danny had the photographs and was willing to provide a sworn statement, which Catherine said would be valuable as supporting evidence for the fraternization component. I also called my old platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant Leon Briggs, who was now stationed at Fort Stewart. He wasn't directly involved, but he knew Calloway by reputation and confirmed something I'd heard secondhand. Calloway had previously had a relationship with a female soldier in his previous assignment that had been quietly buried by a complicit commander. The pattern mattered. Each new piece I uncovered was worse than the last. The transfer request wasn't an isolated impulse. Calloway had done a version of this before, used his positional authority to manage personal relationships by moving inconvenient people. The difference was that this time, the inconvenient person had found out before the paperwork was submitted, had a paper trail that was now in the hands of an attorney, and wasn't interested in a quiet resolution. I filed the IG complaint on a Wednesday. I retained Catherine Dole and had divorce papers drawn up the same week. I had already moved Olivia's listed address to her sister's place in Columbus through the housing office using the standard form. She'd gone there after leaving the house. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. Every communication went through Catherine. Calloway found out about the IG complaint 5 days after I filed it. I know the exact moment because Danny saw him come out of the S3 shop looking like the floor had dropped out from under him and make 2 rapid phone calls in the parking lot. Danny didn't hear the calls. He didn't need to. The sequence of what followed told the story on its own. The first thing Calloway did was call Olivia. I know this because Catherine received a call from Olivia's attorney 2 days later wanting to know if there was any scenario in which I would withdraw the misconduct report in exchange for an uncontested divorce. Catherine relayed the offer. I told her no. I was not interested in a negotiated peace. I was interested in a complete and accurate accounting. The second thing Calloway did was send a mutual acquaintance, a captain named Greg Harris, who was marginally friendly with both of us, to talk to me. Harris approached me after PT one morning and said he'd heard things were rough and that maybe there was a way to work through this that didn't have to get ugly. I told Harris that I appreciated him coming to talk to me, and that I was going to cut contact with him immediately after this conversation because he'd allowed himself to be used as a messenger by a man who had co-signed orders to ship me to a combat zone, and that made his continued presence in my life unnecessary. Harris looked like he'd been slapped. He walked away. I blocked his number that afternoon. The investigation moved faster than I expected, partly because of the existing interest from the IG's office and partly because Calloway made the critical mistake of trying to amend the personnel action records after the complaint was filed, an attempt to obscure the routing irregularities that was itself a violation and that was caught by the IG investigator within 48 hours because the original digital timestamps didn't match the amended versions. When you try to cover your tracks on a government system, you leave new tracks. Calloway apparently hadn't thought that through. 72 hours after the amendment attempt was discovered, Lieutenant Colonel Brett Calloway was relieved of his duties as Brigade S3 pending investigation. His access to personnel systems was suspended. He was assigned to a holding capacity with no command or staff authority. I heard he left the building after being relieved and sat in his F-150 in the parking lot for 40 minutes without starting the engine. I didn't check. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks after I filed. Olivia didn't contest the terms once her attorney made clear that contesting them would require a full airing of the circumstances in a proceeding where the IG report would be entered as evidence. She signed. The quarters went to me pending my decision on reassignment. The joint accounts were divided. 6 years of what I thought was a life came apart with remarkable administrative efficiency. What I hadn't told anyone yet, not Thomas, not Danny, not Catherine, was the plan I'd been building in parallel to all of this. 3 weeks after the confrontation, during the period when I was running on cold fury and organizational precision, I had a conversation with Colonel Whitfield that went beyond the IG referral. He asked me, in the quiet way that senior officers sometimes ask things that matter, what my career trajectory looked like. I told him I was considering warrant officer candidate school. I had the technical background and the time and grade. Whitfield listened and then told me that based on what he'd seen of my performance over the years and the additional file documentation he'd recently reviewed, he thought I was thinking too small. He asked me if I'd ever considered OCS, Officer Candidate School, become an officer. I'd considered it 5 years earlier and set it aside because Olivia had been the officer in our household and the dynamic had seemed complicated enough already. That reason no longer existed. Whitfield said he would write the recommendation himself. He also quietly indicated that the current situation, the IG investigation, the personnel misconduct, the demonstrated pattern in Callaway's record, had created certain administrative turbulence at the brigade level that would likely result in several positions being vacated and restructured. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. I applied to OCS the same month my divorce was finalized. I was 34 years old, which put me at the upper edge of the enlisted to officer pipeline but well within regulation. My evaluation reports were exceptional. Whitfield's recommendation was, according to Catherine, who had contacts in the Army personnel community, one of the strongest she'd heard of for an OCS packet at that level. My APFT scores were in the top 5% for my age bracket. I had a bachelor's degree I'd finished through distance learning during 2 previous deployments. I was accepted to OCS Fort Benning 4 months after applying. I want to be precise about what Callaway lost in the time between my filing and my departure for OCS, because precision matters and because vague summaries don't do justice to what actually happened. He lost the S3 position permanently. The investigation concluded that the personnel action irregularity and the fraternization constituted violations of Articles 92 and 134 of the UCMJ. He was not court-martialed, which was a decision I didn't fully agree with but had no control over. The Army sometimes resolves these things administratively when the officer in question agrees to certain terms. He received a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, which was filed in his permanent record. He was passed over for promotion to full colonel. He was reassigned to a training and doctrine command position at a base in Missouri with no operational authority. The career he had built, the operational credibility, the S3 reputation, the trajectory toward battalion command, was finished. Olivia received a letter of reprimand at the company level for her role in co-signing the fraudulent personnel action. She was not relieved of command immediately. The investigation found her culpability secondary to Callaway's, which I believed was legally correct even if it sat sourly with me personally. She was, however, flagged in her evaluation report, which meant her next promotion board would see the documentation. She was transferred out of 2nd Support Battalion 3 months after the investigation concluded, reassigned to a post in Texas as a staff officer. She took the new position quietly. Her sister called me once, 2 months after the divorce was final. I let it go to voicemail. I did not call back. There was still one thing left to do. I hadn't forgotten it. I was just waiting for the right moment. OCS was 17 weeks of the most focused, physically demanding, and professionally shaping time of my life. I was older than most of my classmates and had more enlisted time than any of them, which created an interesting dynamic. I wasn't the strongest candidate on the physical fitness metrics because the younger candidates were simply younger, but I was the candidate who understood how the Army actually worked, how soldiers thought, how missions fell apart in the spaces between planning and execution. The cadre noticed. My peers noticed. I graduated 3rd in my class and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant on a Friday morning with Colonel Whitfield in the audience. I did not invite Olivia. She was not there. My first assignment as an officer was to the 10th Mountain Division at Fort Drum, New York, as far from Fort Denton, Georgia, as I could reasonably have ended up in the continental United States, which suited me precisely. I was a platoon leader in an infantry battalion, then a company executive officer, then, after a deployment to Eastern Europe during a period of heightened NATO readiness operations, a company commander. I was good at it. Not in the way that looks impressive in photographs but in the way that produces results in conditions where results are hard to produce. My soldiers were trained well and treated fairly and held to standards that were high enough to matter and explained clearly enough to be understood. I was promoted to captain 18 months after commissioning, which was fast. To major 3 years after that, which was also fast. I attended the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, where I graduated in the top 10% of my year group and was selected for a broadening assignment at the Pentagon working Joint Operational Planning. I spent 2 years in that assignment and learned more about how power actually flows in military institutions than I had learned in the previous decade. I was promoted to lieutenant colonel at the 11-year officer mark. My battalion command assignment came immediately after, a field artillery battalion at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. We deployed to the Pacific Theater. We came back with 2 unit citations and a record that my brigade commander described in writing as the strongest operational performance he'd seen in that command slot in his career. I was selected for promotion to colonel and given a brigade command assignment. And when the assignment cycle for that brigade command was published, the designated location was Fort Denton, Georgia. 2nd Brigade Combat Team, Fort Denton. The same installation. The same brigade that had once housed an S3 named Callaway and a headquarters company commander named Captain Olivia Hargrove. I sat with that assignment notification for a long time. Then I called Thomas, because I still called Thomas when things mattered. He said, "So you're going back?" I said, "I'm going back." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Richard, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Are you going back there to do your job or are you going back there for something else?" I said, "Both. But the job comes first. The job has always come first." He said, Okay then, I believe you. He was right too. The job did come first. I want that to be clear because what happened next could look like revenge theater if you didn't understand the genuine professional substance underneath it. I commanded that brigade with the same standards I'd applied everywhere else. My soldiers performed. My staff was held to account. The installation commander, a major general named Harold Sutton, described my first 6 months in command as among the most operationally focused brigade command transitions he'd seen. But I was paying attention. I had been paying attention since I walked back onto that installation for the first time in over a decade and stood in the parking lot of the headquarters building and felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. Olivia had transferred back to Fort Denton 8 months before my arrival. I learned this through the normal process of reviewing my subordinate unit rosters. She was now a major, assigned to the Division G4 as a logistics staff officer. Not in my brigade, but on my installation. I noted it and moved on. I told no one. I did not adjust my professional behavior in any direction because of it. What I did do, 6 months into my command, was compile a comprehensive after-action review of the personnel management irregularities that had occurred in the brigade during the period of Calloway's tenure as S3. This was a legitimate command responsibility. Understanding historical administrative problems was part of taking effective command. The review identified 14 instances of non-standard personnel routing during Calloway's 18 months as S3. The review was thorough, documented, and submitted to the installation IG as an addendum to the original case file. It wasn't new action against Calloway, who was already gone and flagged. It was institutional record-keeping, but it made the full scope of what he'd done a matter of permanent official record in a way that the original investigation hadn't captured. I was selected for promotion to Brigadier General 11 months into my brigade command. Early, faster than the standard timeline by 8 months, which was unusual enough that it generated comment in the circles where these things were discussed. The basis was the operational record, the Pacific deployment performance, the Pentagon broadening assignment, the current brigade command evaluation. Colonel Whitfield, who was now himself a major general, wrote a recommendation that I later learned was circulated among the promotion board members as a reference example. I was promoted to brigadier general on a Tuesday morning at Fort Denton. The ceremony was held at the installation's main parade field. General Sutton presided. Thomas was there. Danny Webb, who had by then left the Army and was running a security consulting firm in Atlanta, drove up that morning. Leon Briggs, now a retired master sergeant, attended in civilian clothes. Catherine Dole sent flowers. The installation's senior staff, both assigned officers and civilians, attended as a matter of protocol. That included the Division G4 staff. That included Major Olivia Hargrove. I didn't look for her in the crowd. I didn't need to. I was told afterward, by my new aide-de-camp, a sharp young captain named Kevin Aldridge, that she had been standing in the rear of the formation during the ceremony and had left immediately after the conclusion without attending the reception. Aldridge mentioned it because he'd noticed her expression. He described it carefully, the way young officers describe things they're not sure how to contextualize, and said she'd looked like someone who had watched something they couldn't undo. He was right about that. She had. The assignment notification had come 6 weeks before the promotion ceremony, and it had been processed through the standard division administrative channels, which meant that every staff officer at the division level had seen the incoming command assignment before I pinned on the stars. The incoming commanding general for Fort Denton installation, replacing Major General Sutton upon his retirement, would be Brigadier General Richard Hargrove. She had seen my name on that document. She had known I was coming back as the general over her base for 6 weeks before she stood in the back of that parade field and watched it become official. I thought about that a fair amount. 6 weeks of knowing. 6 weeks of the math landing. The men she'd signed transfer orders for to ship to Helmand Province was now the commanding general of the installation she served on. There's a particular kind of reckoning that doesn't require a confrontation or a speech or a dramatic scene. It just requires time and work and the willingness to become something that nobody who counted you out expected you to become. I received her request for a transfer to another installation 3 days after my promotion ceremony. It was routed through the G4 and came to my office for approval as installation commander. Routine transfers required the commanding general's authorization. Kevin put it on my desk in the afternoon reading pile. I sat with it for a while. Not because I was going to deny it for personal reasons, I wasn't. That would have been an abuse of the authority I'd spent 12 years earning the right to hold. But I sat with it because of the strange completeness of the moment. The last official interaction between Richard Hargrove and Olivia Hargrove, we were no longer Hargroves in the same way. She'd reverted to her maiden name, Olivia Crane, officially, though the paperwork still showed the former name as an alias, was her asking me to let her leave. I approved the transfer. Same day. No annotation, no delay, no added conditions. I signed my name at the bottom and initialed the routing block and handed it back to Kevin. Clean and final, the way everything in the end should be. Calloway, I heard, had retired at the lieutenant colonel rank under the administrative terms of his Goma resolution, which meant he was technically retired military but without the trajectory he'd built his career around. He was living in Missouri, according to someone who'd served with him early in his career and still tracked these things loosely. I didn't check. Someone mentioned it at a staff function and I nodded and moved on, and that was the extent of the attention I gave it. There was something I needed to do, though. Something that wasn't about them at all, which is maybe why it mattered the most. The week after my promotion, I drove to the on-post chapel and sat in one of the back pews for about 20 minutes. Not for religious reasons, particularly, though I wasn't opposed to them. I sat there because it was quiet and I needed to think in a place where nobody was going to come to ask me something or need a decision from me. I sat there and I went through the whole architecture of it, the kitchen drawer, the envelope, the Waffle House with Danny, Thomas at my kitchen table, the confrontation, OCS, Fort Drum, the deployment to Eastern Europe, the promotion boards, the parade field. I sat there and I tried to locate any residual feeling for Olivia, not love, I knew that was gone, but anything. Anger, bitterness, satisfaction at how things had turned out. I found that what I felt was mostly indifference, with a thin layer of something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. Because here was the truth of it, if she hadn't signed those orders, I would have stayed at Fort Denton as a staff sergeant, probably made it to master sergeant, probably retired at 20 years with a respectable record and a quiet life. I would have been content with that. I had been content with that, and contentment, I now understood, had been making me smaller than I was. She'd tried to remove me from the board. Instead, she'd pushed me into the deep end and found out I could swim in ways neither of us had known. I didn't think about her anymore, until now. And now I'm done. In the 2 years that followed my installation command assignment, I commissioned a full independent review of personnel management practices at Fort Denton that resulted in new routing protocols designed to prevent the kind of authority laundering that Callaway had used. The review was adopted as a model for 3 other installations. It became part of the Human Resources Command's reference framework for officer misconduct in personnel administration. My name was on the report in the standard way, as the commissioning authority. Callaway's name was in the historical section, as the documented case that had prompted the need. I also mentored 11 enlisted soldiers through OCS applications during my command tour, personally reviewing each packet and advocating with the selection board for the strongest candidates. Danny Webb's younger brother was one of them. He commissioned as a second lieutenant the spring of my second year in command. I attended his ceremony in the same spot where mine had been held, on the same parade field at Fort Benning, and I shook his hand and told him that his brother was one of the most important people in my life and that the Army was lucky to have him. Danny was there that day. He drove up from Atlanta in his truck, wore a jacket and tie, stood off to the side the way he always did. Afterward we got dinner at a place he'd found near the highway, nothing fancy, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. He asked me once, over coffee, if I ever thought about how differently it could have gone, if the envelope had made it to my CO's desk before I'd found it, if the transfer had processed, if I'd been in Helmand Province when the divorce was filed. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. It's there, but I'm not on it. He nodded. He understood. The chapter was closed. The next one was better than anything I could have written before. And I wrote it myself, one promotion board and one pre-dawn run and one decision at a time, with no one's signature required but my own.